Hello and welcome, my dear viewers, to this third session of Q&A on this channel, where I will be answering the questions that you sent in to me. And the first question will be from Toha al-Himyari. Can you make a video about the Himyarite kingdom? To clarify to some of my viewers here, the Himyarite kingdom was an ancient kingdom in southern Arabia, in what is modern-day Yemen, and parts of southern Saudi Arabia, before the time of Islam, that among other things also converted to Judaism, and then later Christianity, and it was quite a flourishing and important kingdom in southern Arabia, until it eventually got conquered by the Aksumite Empire, an empire based in Eastern Africa. But in any case, as to what regards your question, I have planned this actually, to do this in the future. And I've actually tried to make a video, or rather make a script about this, at 2 times previously, though both times real life kept interfering. The first time when I tried to get access to the books that I needed, the sources regarding writing this script, someone else was needing those sources, and I didn't want to interfere with this guy's work, as I make videos as a hobby, and this guy that had borrowed these books had borrowed them as part of a research project at the university, and I didn't want to interfere with that, as I also know that guy, and I know that he works a lot with South Arabian history. Then once I wanted to return to write this script about the Himyarite kingdom once again, I got busy with another in real life task, together with the fact that I did not get the resources that I thought I needed in order to make a good video, in terms of visual media to use in the video, in terms of the visual resources that were needed in order to make that video. And I also had some other things planned in parallel with this, both with regards to this channel and videos on it, together with the fact that I had a lot on my plate in real life during this time, and thus I postponed writing a script and making a video about the Himyarite kingdom. Hopefully in the future I will sit down and do it. That is to say, write a script about the Himyarite kingdom and make a video about it. And hopefully it will be done this year, though I can't 100% promise you this, as I have a lot of other stuff planned, and again, things can happen in real life. But I plan to make a video, though a lot of this is subject to various circumstances. Next question is from Anders Shimich 8600. Favorite Iranian Intermezzo dynasty? It's Buyids for me. Just to give a little bit of context here for my viewers that might not know, the Iranian Intermezzo is a period of from about the 9th century to the 11th century of various native Iranian Muslim dynasties and entities rising up and reviving Persian culture and power in Central Asia and in the Eastern Middle East, following the gradual breakup of the previous Arabized Caliphal dynasty. And during this period and in this area of the Eastern Middle East and Central Asia, a lot of various Persian dynasties arose and fell. And among these dynasties, I almost want to say that the Buyids were the most important and interesting dynasty too. Though, since you already selected that alternative, I would say that there are some competitors that I could consider to be more interesting in certain aspects too. For example, the Tahirids, which were the first major dynasty of the Iranian Intermezzo, and the first example of breaking away from the Abbasid authority, which makes it as a precursor that is very interesting to study. It also helps that a lot of the main sources about them are written in Arabic and not in Persian, which is a problem with the later dynasties of the Iranian Intermezzo. A problem for me, as I can't understand Persian, as I've never studied the language, unlike Arabic. Then you have also the Safarids, which were the first very powerful and politically very important of these dynasties for the history of the Middle East. Just due to the sheer fact that they managed to become so big and powerful. And thus they stand out as the first very powerful of these Iranian Intermezzo dynasties. Here you could still argue that the Buyids were more powerful and more important too, but the Safavids were still the first major Persian dynasty in the Iranian Intermezzo period, and are thus pretty interesting to study as the first example of the major Intermezzo dynasties. Then you have the Ghaznavids, which are important for their conquest and expansion into the Indian subcontinent and the effects that they had there. And they also had far-reaching effects when it comes to cultural influence, even into the Western Middle East too. And they are a very strong contender with the Buyids for the most important of the Iranian Intermezzo period dynasties. Though the Buyids are a hard contender in the top of the various Intermezzo period dynasties, since they were so influential and important historically, which makes them a very fascinating dynasty to study. Not to mention their very fascinating politico-religious history of going from being Sayyidi Shia into Twelver Shia, and all of the matters surrounding that. But generally I can't really say that I have just one favorite here. It depends upon which aspects I want to look at, because history can be looked at from many different aspects. But if I was forced to just select one favorite in a very generalized way, I would probably, like you, also select the Buyids as my preferred favorite Iranian Intermezzo dynasty. Next question is from Saria Al-Hajj Mustafa, 2573. Your Arabic is okay. When did you start learning Arabic? About 10 years ago, I started learning the language at university. Then I studied at university for several years, up to master level. Then I also utilized the language in my studies of history, in my studies of Arabic history at university. I used it when I studied various sources for both my bachelor and later master in history. And I did this in parallel with learning the language as well at university. And then I have also used the language outside of university for various in real life tasks and work, and for various social interactions with friends and acquaintances from the Arab world. Though it should be said that I was actually dabbling a bit into Arabic before I studied it in university, as I already had before my studies in Arabic an interest in Arabic culture and history. And doing intensive Arabic studies at university and learning the language became part of a toolkit that I could use in order to understand these things better. And that is not even to mention the fact that I actually thought it was pretty fun to learn Arabic, as it was a challenging language to learn, and quite different from the various languages I knew before. Now, the next question is from Mario Muse, 8265. Hi, I like your content. And I'm honored that you like my content. We met on a Discord channel a few months ago. I think I remember that, yes. My question, do you think climate change denial and COVID-19 denialism have a religious origin within Christianity and Islam? The philosophical traditions of the Western religions seem ill-equipped to deal with collective action when nature is involved. This is a very complex topic, as both Islam and Christianity are very large traditions with many interpretations within them. And there are interpretations that include respect and care for nature and resources that are held in common too, and treating the victims of sickness with the best care available, and that kind of implies acceptance of the existence of sicknesses as an existing phenomenon. But also, on the other hand, you have religious interpretations about diseases being the will of God and views about the world being created to support us by divine will, and thus something that will always be available to humanity by divine intervention. And these ideas can stand in conflict with, for example, combating COVID-19 or ideas about climate change. Though regarding these matters, something that I want to point out is that these matters are not merely questions about facts, but also politics, and connected to political choices, and not only religion in itself. Though religion often is connected to politics, and politics often connect to religion. So there is no great separation here, especially with religions such as Islam that are highly orthopractical. Orthopractical being focused upon correct actions, and connected to these are often actions and ideas that are highly political. But on a greater meta level, what I wanted to say here is more about that these matters regarding COVID and climate change are often a matter more about what you value than about the factuality. Or rather, it is about conflicting values and conflicting facts and aims in politics. And other values and aims and facts can be valued as more important in certain political conceptions and views on politics. Because both COVID denialism and climate change denialism are connected to politics and are not only matters about facts. For example, if you look at the states in the United States that have had the highest degrees of denialism in these matters, in those places you usually have a strong, long-lasting tradition of not wanting the government involved in various matters. There is a tradition of wanting an as non-interfering government as possible. And when you think about that, you can see that, for example, COVID-19 measures or measures against climate change will require government interference and thus sacrifices of what for these people can be viewed as sacrifices of liberty and independence from government. We are thus noticing a conflict of aims and values here that are also conflicting with these facts. And just to be clear here, I'm not saying that COVID measures or climate change measures are more important than liberty, or that liberty and independence from government is more important than COVID-19 measures and climate change measures. I'm actually standing outside of discussing what is correct here. I'm just analyzing it in a neutral way here, or as close to neutral as I can be, in order to explain the underlying issue here. Because as part of this conflict of interests, aims and values, you can see that in this conflict, denial can sometimes be seen as easier than just accepting conflicting priorities and aims, where one outweighs the other. Because accepting a fact can give it weight, even if you know that that fact is true or not true. Accepting these facts or not can give weight to an argument in a political context. And you can even be in situations where two political positions are not about facts, but rather about conflicting value judgments regarding what is proper. And if you're on one side or on the side of another, then arguing against the facts that are used to prop up the opposition can be a tool of political activism and of political argumentation. And denialism can here be part of this. Though, to be clear, there also exists genuine denial of facts and genuine denialism too. Because some people do not think that a fact is a fact or true. Because humans are epistemologically limited. We do not know everything correctly, always, all the time. And sometimes we make mistakes, or are not rational in our thought processes. Even if I believe that in most cases, most people are rational in their choices and thought processes. It is usually a case of conflicting value judgments rather than a lack of rationality. But it should not be denied that people are sometimes irrational and do make mistakes in their thinking or in their understanding of things around them. And it is important to not be too hard upon someone that has misunderstood something. And this goes for both people that accept facts or deny facts. And even if you suspect people of being intentionally dishonest, it is usually better to just assume that they do not know or do not understand the matter. And it is better to explain it to them in as respectable way as possible. Because, as I said before, sometimes people do simply not know better. And even if they might know better than what they are claiming, being respectable still reflects good upon yourself. And while explaining things in a respectable and thought out manner might not convince the one that you're debating these matters with, it might still convince others that are viewing this debate, or it might, if you are only debating one-on-one without others viewing it, make the other part in these discussions less hostile to you in other matters outside of the matter discussed. Furthermore, intentional dishonesty for various facts or against various facts is still not really relevant, because discussing the dishonesty of the person is an ad hominem. It is about the person rather than about the bad argument in itself or the bad argumentation regarding a fact. So treat people as they are just lacking understanding rather than them being intentionally dishonest, even if they are as such. But now I went into a bit of a side tangent. So I want to go back to what I wanted to discuss here regarding ignoring facts because it is easier than not. And that has to do with using religious elements to prop up this sort of denialism and such. Because essentially, in a lot of cases, religion is used to prop up a sort of politics. And if the politics is connected to a sort of denialism, or benefits from a sort of denialism that is propagated, then this sort of use of religion will also become connected to this sort of denialism as well. And it is likely in these sorts of relationships between politics and religion that religion will be interpreted in such a way as to justify the politics. That is to say, religion becomes subordinate to political aims, rather than the political aims being the result of the religion. Though, of course, there usually are back and forth interactions here. And this isn't just limited to, for example, the Western world and the use of Christianity when it comes to climate denialism. You can see similar in the Islamic world too. For example, oil sells for good money after all. And a lot of countries in the Islamic world do sell oil. And they want to continue this. And arguments about climate change can go against this. Very profitable business. And thus you could, for example, get religious arguments that suit arguments against climate change, that deny climate change. For example, though you also have conflicting values and priorities here, because a lot of the Middle East, for example, is very exposed to climate change as well. So you also get arguments based upon religion in the other direction too. But generally, these issues about climate and COVID denialism are usually not issues about facts only, but rather these issues about denial and of facts and denialism are issues that are connected to greater political issues and discussions. And collective action generally is often very hard when you have people with different interests, priorities, and value judgments generally. And I do not think that it is so much worse with Western religious traditions than with Eastern traditions, as I think that these matters are connected rather to other political matters. Though I will say, as I do not have great knowledge about Buddhism or Hinduism, I can't say with any firm conviction that there is not a difference between, for example, Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam and Christianity when it comes to matters regarding nature and climate change and diseases such as COVID and their relationship to denialism. This is a very complex matter within even a singular religious tradition, within these greater religions. And I'm just barely scratching the surface here and giving a very generalized answer. But I hope it will suffice for you, even if it is very basic. The next question is from Omar 0 bin 0 Thabit. I've been wondering how Arabic literature of the Dark Ages offers a distinct lens for understanding non-Abrahamic religions during that time. For instance, the Norse were often referred to as Majus, and the Turkic term Tengri was sometimes aligned with Allah or God in Arabic. By studying these perspectives, could we move beyond simply labeling such groups as pagans or heathens? Perhaps this approach would allow us to uncover deeper details about their beliefs, cultures, and how they were understood in the Arab intellectual and literary context. This is a rather complex matter, as we do have a lot of material that deals with both the Norsemen and the Turks in the Arabic literary tradition from this time. And there is definitely a potential to get more information about these ancient, now extinct religious traditions from there. There are some potential issues though also, as we are discussing foreign religions through writers that have another religion, Islam. And then you have Islam's traditional view on polytheistic religions, which is a complete rejection of anything close to polytheism as shirk, attributing partners to God. And thus there is a great risk of a bias against these religions in the writings of these Dark Ages Arab writers that wrote about their encounters with the Norsemen and the Turks. Though this is more the case with the Norsemen than the Turks who followed Tengrism, which is more of a pantheistic belief, though with polytheistic elements. Yet pantheism and pantheistic beliefs have also had a history of rejection within Islam. Pantheism being that you believe that God is present in everything, and everything is present in God. Though here you could also argue that there exist certain Sufi traditions and certain theological traditions that do contain similar views within Islam too. So it really depends upon the religious Islamic background of the writer. Then you also need to consider that these people that wrote about these religions were Muslims and simply observers or even secondary recountants of others' stories about these peoples. Consequently, they probably were not that knowledgeable about the true meaning of various practices or what really happens in the descriptions of these practices that we can see described in certain sources, such as the Norsemen's funerary practices as described in Ibn Fadlan's work. Things could here be misunderstood or simplified due to lacking understanding of what was really practiced among these peoples. And you also see a lot of simplifications and just stereotypifications of other religions and other peoples in the Arabic literary tradition from this time. You see, for example, the term Majus, Magi, being used for Zoroastrians originally. Zoroastrians being followers of Zoroastrianism, a religion that was practiced by the old Persians and still lives to this day as a small minority in Iran, India and elsewhere, where you have an Iranic diaspora. But in many Arabic works, it was later also applied to a lot of other peoples, including the Norse people. This is mostly due to a rather uncaring attitude about these people from the north, as they were pretty much viewed as uncivilized barbarians. And thus simplifications such as calling them Majus because they had similar fire rituals was done, because people didn't really care about the details about these peoples from the north, as they were seen as unimportant in comparison to the civilized Middle East. And thus you did not give many details about them, because it was not important to give many details about them, except in certain cases. And this is also a source of potential bias. And that is that there is a risk of exotification in much of the Arabic literature too, as there is a risk of a bias in the literature of describing these northern peoples as the foreign other and making them seem more extreme or strange than they really were. And there is a reason for this. And it is not only due to them having another religion, even if that was also a reason for this, but due to the fact that there existed a monetary interest also in exotifying the northern peoples. Because many of the Arabic works from this time were written to be copied and sold to an audience. And in order to make a work exciting and to draw a crowd to buy your work, you make the other more interesting by exotifying the other, by exotifying the descriptions of the peoples in the work, such as the northern peoples. There is a definite bias risk here too. So there are several factors of potential bias in the sources regarding their descriptions of other religions. Though not all sources are the same, and there are sources that are better or worse than others in terms of various types of bias and such, and could be argued to be better or worse in terms of reliability in their descriptions of other religions, like the Norsemen's polytheistic faiths or the Tengriism of the pre-Islamic Turks. So this matter depends a lot upon the source used, and it also depends upon the question that you are posing to the sources and what you want to study regarding these other religions, or the attitude towards these religions. And depending upon the question and the focus, a source might not be as problematic as it would have been to use as a source for another question or other focus. And there certainly are sources that could give very good answers to certain questions and focuses when it comes to the religions of the northern peoples, such as the Norsemen and the pre-Islamic Turks, and the Arabic writers' attitudes towards them. In fact, you could even argue that a heavily biased work against the Norsemen and the pre-Islamic Turks might reveal a lot of the attitude that existed among certain segments of Arab society during that period. Furthermore, you have other issues than just bias issues. And that can be the issue that there is a problem in what the sources are focusing upon. Many of the sources that describe, for example, the Norsemen, focus upon other aspects than religion. Sure, Ahmed ibn Fadlan mentions religion, but other works, like Ibn Yaqub, mostly focus upon other aspects related to old Nordic society, meaning that they do not mention much about religion or things that are easily identified as connected to the religious thoughts and practices of these peoples. And furthermore, you have a problem with the fact that the writings of several Arab writers during this period differ from each other in not only the geography from which they are writing or which they are describing, but they also differ sometimes by several centuries from each other, meaning that they are describing vastly different places and vastly different times, as well as are from different backgrounds, meaning that they also interpret things differently as well, meaning that there is a huge amount of potential diversity here as well, not only in potentially differing religious practices among the people described, but also in the interpretations of these practices that can have been colored by these writers being from different places and times. And this is also very problematic, because then it becomes hard to distinguish what is a difference of simply time and place from what is a difference of interpretation, or what a writer considered to be important to include. Add to this the fact that many polytheistic traditions and religions are usually not unified, in that they have a big standardized religion. You usually have a lot of local practices that are different from other local practices, even if you might share certain traditions with other places, like sharing certain shared main gods. And this is very much the suspected case for Old Norse religion too, where we, for example, suspect that there was a difference between the Norsemen that lived closer to the coasts in comparison to the Nordic peoples that lived more inland on the Scandinavian peninsula, because we have noticed certain differences in the names on runestones and with regards to the gods mentioned. Now, this is very much not my field of expertise, but I remember being told about this by an expert in this field. But in any case, we are actually in truth not probably talking about a Nordic religion, but rather a tradition of Nordic religions, or various variants of a Nordic tradition of polytheistic religion. So even if an Arabic writer actually did write a lot about his experiences with a certain group of Norsemen and their religious practices, it might not be the case that this is representative of other groups and their practices. But certainly, the Arabic sources can still be used to describe certain points or scenes from specific cases of old polytheistic Norse religious traditions, even if they might not be representative for every group that we would consider to be part of this old polytheistic Norse tradition. And it does at least give a certain level of understanding for at least some practices and some aspects of the web that we call Old Norse religion. This web of similar religious traditions that we call Norse religion. Notice also that I've never used the term pagan or heathen about these groups, or the Arabic variants such as mushrikun, because by labeling these peoples by those standards, you actually apply either a Christian or Islamic standard of monotheistic belief upon these religious traditions as being faulty for not being monotheistic. And this is something that is also important to keep in mind when you are reading either Islamic sources or Christian sources that are describing polytheistic religions. They are written from the perspective of a monotheist that most probably has prejudgments about polytheistic religions. And studying these sources in order to search for descriptions and trying to get to the underlying facts requires you to be self-aware about both your own biases and also the biases of the writers whose works you are studying. And here it is important to be aware about naming standards and what those imply about various religions and how they are called and described in the sources. And I think this process of trying to handle these various biases and trying to interpret things in the shadow of these biases helps you also to look at these old religious traditions that are described in another light than just as pagans, heathens, mushrikun, or something like that. Because you are trying to actively distance yourself from those kinds of views when you're studying these sources with a source critical view that tries to eliminate biases or mitigate the problems with certain biases. And it is a process that helps us discover the complexities that exist in sources and how we view other groups through various sources and in our views of history. And I think that this aspect of studying sources and of trying to apply a source critical method and trying to eliminate our own biases and to be self-aware about how we name things and from which the naming of these things come from and what they imply can help us develop an understanding of other groups and thus help us move beyond simply labeling the Norse polytheistic believers simply as pagans or heathens or mushrikun, as we become self-aware that those terms are actually applying the standards of Christianity or Islam upon another religion and not studying the religion from a neutral point of view. And also notice that I do emphasize the process here of source critical thinking and self-reflection upon the terms used to describe groups here. Because you could potentially read these sources about these Norse polytheistic groups and come to the conclusion that they are some sort of stereotyped inferior group if you uncritically just take the views as presented without any sort of criticism from the majority of the sources, which are often influenced by Islamic or Christian thinking when it comes to descriptions about these Nordic polytheists. So it is not only about studying these perspectives that exist in, for example, Arabic sources or in European Christian sources, but also about applying a source critical self-reflective method about how we think about groups and how groups are described that helps us move beyond describing these groups simply as pagans or heathens and viewing them as some sort of stereotype rather than viewing them as an historic religious tradition in its own right. A tradition that probably was very complex and multifaceted with many local variants of it. And I have mostly mentioned the Old Norse religion here, because I'm not that familiar with Tengrism as I am with Old Norse religion. But similar rules and considerations apply there too, with regards to studies about that. And it is finally my belief that if you apply this sort of process in a rigorous and self-reflective way and also study various sources, various different sources, and also have an awareness about all of the other sorts of biases and potential issues with the sources that exist, some of which I have mentioned in this answer, but there exist more than those probably. And there also probably exist specific problems and biases connected to specific writers too. But if you take these issues and biases in consideration and adapt your analysis with these things considered, you can get probably to a deeper understanding about various details connected to these old beliefs, cultures, and how they were understood in the Arab intellectual and literary context. And this is my rather long answer, but still rather simplified answer to the rather complex matter that you presented here in your questions. The next question is from The Dead Warrior. Hi, I'm hoping you are doing great. I am doing great, even if I have been somewhat busy in real life recently. So my questions are, would we ever get a video about the development of royal/imperial titles in Arabic culture / arabized cultures and how it developed and changed and affected the view of institutions of power? I find it a fascinating subject, especially when you go to the Persianized South Asia and East Asian kingdoms. Next question is, what do you think of the reign of Alghury, the last mamluk sultan to rule the Levant? I find him and his era a very understudied and misunderstood era, even when we have a lot of resources about it. Finally, what do you think of the development of historical studies in the Arab world in the pre-colonial era, and specifically how different Eastern, specifically from Cairo, and Western historians treated history after the 1200s and 1300s? As for your first questions, I might do a video about the development of royal and imperial titles within the Islamicate world in the future. I've actually planned something like that from before, even if it is still only on the drawing board, and I wanted to limit it to the Middle East only, as South Asia and East Asian kingdoms are a bit outside of my expertise. Though it is a very fascinating topic, as there is a conflict, or rather tension, between the concept of mulk, earthly authority in kingship, and the traditional Islamic concepts of power. That is rather fascinating to discuss, especially with regards to various titles and conceptualizations of power relationships in Middle Eastern history, and probably also is reflected elsewhere too. But I will need to look more into specific history there if I ever go outside of the Middle East. But I can tell you, just discussions about kingship power and the titles associated with that, and Islamic concepts about power relationships in the Middle East alone, would be enough to make several hours worth of videos. And I do plan to make videos about this. I cannot tell you when, or if it will even be any video this year about this, but it is possible that it might come this year. As for your second question about Al-Ashraf Kansu Alghury, the second last Mamluk Sultan, who reigned from 1501 to 1516 until his death, facing the Ottomans outside of Aleppo in Syria. I'm not exactly an expert on this era, so I can't really comment upon it being understudied, or Al-Ghazali being understudied in particular, in comparison to the source material that exists. But I kind of find him to be a ruler that was kind of thrown into a situation that he tried to handle, but did not succeed in handling, not due to being a bad ruler per se, but simply due to the fact that the situation had become so chaotic and critical once he ascended and took to power, that it was impossible to solve. And you see this with the rebellions in the Hijaz region, the Portuguese naval activity in the Red Sea, various diplomatic issues with various other entities around the Mediterranean Sea, and the Ottomans gaining more power and eventually overpowering his forces in the Levant, and at the same time being beset by constant court politics inside of the Mamluk state as well, which were so bad that he didn't even want to be the leader of the Mamluk Sultanate due to the fact that he feared he would eventually get killed in these court intrigues that were constant in the Mamluk Sultanate. But you also see that he tried to solve these issues, and he tried to do politics that would have solved various issues that he faced inside of his realm. He did remove a lot of two-man base, the previous sultan's supporters, once he was selected as the new leader. He did do various deals with the rebels in the Hijaz region and eventually managed to pacify those rebellions by actually improving local leadership and compromising in a way that wasn't a clear defeat nor a brutal, devastating crackdown either. He did have limited success against the Portuguese as well in the Red Sea, and he did enter into an alliance with the Safavids against the Ottomans in order to counter their increasing power. And though he has been criticized for this choice of alliance, but it did make sense in context, though he would be defeated by the Ottomans still. And this would be a result also of a betrayal that was done due to the court politics within the Mamluk state. As I mentioned before, the court politics of the Mamluk Sultanate were crazy, and you had constant backstabbings and coups all throughout the Mamluk Sultanate's history from the beginning, though it arguably got worse at the end. But in any case, Alghury was just the last big victim of this. In any case, my view of Alghury is that he was not a bad leader, but just not up to the task of facing the problems that he was facing in this very bad situation that he found himself in. The fact that he still managed to last 15 years was good considering the situation he was in. As a frame of reference, all 4 sultans before him hadn't lasted more than 3 years. So he was in a very unstable situation, but still managed to last several times the time of his predecessors. As for your last question, I kind of have a problem of understanding it exactly if you were intending how people that wrote history after the 12 to 1300s viewed history, or if you're talking about how modern historians in the historical studies viewed the period afterwards. But I will interpret it as being historians just after the 12 to 1300s here, because it kind of interconnects with these later observations of differences between Western historical studies and Middle Eastern historical studies. And I would argue that this difference originates from the very beginning, as the Western and Middle Eastern tradition of historiography or viewing history have always been different from the very beginning due to coming from different civilizations. You, for example, see very early in Middle Eastern historiography the appearance of theoretical frameworks to explain history. You see this in, for example, al-Makrisi's theories of kinship and clanship being the driver of history. You see this in Ibn Khaldun with his early cyclical theories. Though Ibn Khaldun is outside of Egypt and Cairo, he's still probably the most famous example of this early trend in Arabic historiography of theorizing about history in a structured way. One interesting thing about many of these early theorists and historians that use a sort of theoretical framework to analyze history is that many of them were Dahiri Sunnis. Ibn Khaldun is actually suspected to have been a Dahiri Sunni, though he might have been rather a syncretic Sunni Muslim between the Dahiri and the Maliki school. But in any case, others, such as the previously mentioned al-Makrisi, were Dahiris, most of them. And this might have been a result of the fact that the Zahiri school, being a very literalist school of interpretation, might have actually created a need for a way to understand history, to understand the Quran and the Hadiths and the Sirah in its context, which in turn created the need for understanding history, which might have spurred on the development of theories related to history as a way to understand history and thus in the end also understand the Islamic sources. Though not every one of these early historians and theorists of history were Zahiri Muslims. You, for example, have a lot of Shia historians as well, and you have, for example, Ibn Duqmaq, who was a Hanafi Sunni Muslim, and also got into a lot of trouble with the Shafi'i establishment in Egypt due to the fact that he opposed them in matters of interpretation and in various political matters, which also ended with him getting imprisoned and beaten after he made statements against the founder of the Shafi'i school, Ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, who had been active about 600 years before Ibn Duqmaq, but whose followers during that time did not take kindly to Ibn Duqmaq's statements about al-Shafi'i. A lot of the historians during the 14th and 15th century were, I wouldn't say fringe characters, but were persons that weren't really mainstream, except for their historical productions. And the historical tradition of Cairo, of writing history, rises from alternative groups and from non-conformist personalities, be it Zahiri Sunnis, Shia Muslims, or personalities such as Ibn Duqmaq. And these are very productive in writing history. For example, Ibn Duqmaq was said to have written several hundreds of works in history, and some of them still survive to this very day. And Ibn Khaldun, though outside of Egypt and Cairo, is widely regarded as one of the most prominent writers of history in Arabic. And I also many times make references to al-Makrisi and his history too. And it is in this very productive phase of Arab historiography, of writing history, from which much of the historic tradition of Arabic history comes from originally, in the 14th to the 16th centuries. However, after this period, we are beginning to see a decline in the writings of history and in the analysis of history. And history goes back to what had more been the case before, in that history was less about analyzing history or arguing about history as a greater context and more about just recording, like a chronicle, things that had happened, or just making statements about happenings. And you also see less historical writings, though you still see some, like the writings of al-Munawi. And I don't quite know the reason for this. It has been hypothesized that it has to do with the rise of the Ottoman Empire, that acted as kind of a chilling effect upon writing about history. Though I am not entirely convinced by this, and you also have other factors that could be considered, such as other priorities in culture and learning that were prioritized instead due to various other factors among the elites in Egypt and elsewhere in the Middle East. And you also have a lot of other possible factors. But whatever the case may be, it is from this decline of writing history, of going from analyzing history into more chronicling history and writing less of history, from which later modern historians, modern Arab historians, after An-Nakhda, the 19th century Arab Renaissance, are beginning to recover from. And often during the 19th century, they do various mixes of taking influence from Western historians and their traditions of writing history, and try to interpret Middle Eastern history as recorded and chronicled by earlier pre-colonial Arab historians and chroniclers in various syncretisms. And the process develops from there, from trying to find syncretisms and trying to invent new sorts of ways to look at history, rather than just copying the old theories of analyzing history made by the pre-colonial Arab historians. And these later ways often get connected to various political struggles and political ideologies as well, in very complex ways. Everything from left-wing socialist struggles to the nationalist movements of the 20th century to various Islamist interpretations of history are to be found in the historical writings from this later period. In comparison, the Western historiography tradition begins as a tradition of chroniclers and merely recording events, kind of like what happened later in Arabic historical writings. But it begins like that, especially from the monk scribal tradition. But slowly, there begins to evolve traditions of interpreting history, of trying to understand history through various lenses. You see it, for example, in the writings of Machiavelli, then later in Hobbes, and you see it lastly also in Gibbons as well. From the late medieval period to the Enlightenment, you see gradually how history is becoming more and more analytical, going away from merely being about chronicling events, but also now being more connected to interpreting events and analyzing events. And in parallel to these developments, you also see a movement of history production going from being connected to monasteries and monks to being much more of a general skill that cultured and educated persons had. And with the enlightenment of the 18th century and later time eras, you see the development of more modern history with structured theories about how history functions and how to interpret history. So you see kind of the opposite direction in how you interpret history, in that the West begins to theorize more and more, whereas the level of theorizing and viewing history through lenses of theoretical analyzing decreases in the Middle East, until the Middle East gets kind of reopened to this sort of thinking in contact with Europe after Napoleon advances into Egypt. I would say is probably the thing that really kicks reanalyzing history into high gear again, due to being such a series of shocking events. But it also shapes history and how you analyze history. Because whereas many of the countries in Europe were the colonizers rather than the colonized, the Arab world during this era and also somewhat later in the beginning of the 20th century was the one being colonized, which shaped how you analyzed and interpreted history. And this is very clear in how, for example, pre-colonial Arabic historians wrote about the Crusades, for example, versus how Arabic writing historians during and after the colonialism of the Western countries wrote about it. Whereas the first would only describe the Crusades as just being a group more or less of marauders and not of that great importance, and rather focus upon the greater powers of the Middle East as being what really shaped history during that time. The later historians that had been influenced under colonialism began to analyze the Crusades as a type of early colonialism and began to describe them as a big threat that often was described as being heroically stopped by great leaders such as Salahuddin and the later Baybars, who gets more praise for having finished the Crusaders than he gets for having stopped the Mongols, generally, in later writings. And you also try to get away from the Ottoman heritage as well, as the Ottomans get kind of regarded as being the cause for the decline in the Middle East as well. And thus history that is before the Ottomans, before the 16th century, gets promoted and more focused upon. And herein comes especially history before the 13th century, as you had the Mongols' sack of Baghdad and what was viewed as the end of the Golden Age occurring with that sacking in 1258, as that is the history when the Arab world was great. Before the arrival of the Mongols, the Islamic Arabic world was the center of civilization, or at least that was the view, and still is the view in many regards to this day. Even if I would argue that the actual decline, if any such thing actually occurred, happened later, and was less of a decline and more of a relative decline versus the Western world, which was developing more rather than Middle East declining in itself. Though Egypt is actually kind of an exception here, because here you not only have a relative decline, but you also have a real decline in, for example, population that decreases from the late Middle Ages up to the 19th century, where you actually had a higher population in Egypt during the Middle Ages than you had in the 19th century. And since Egypt was an important center of Arab literature and Arabic writing, this view of decline also spread from Egypt to other Arab writers as well, and to other Arab and Middle Eastern history. And I do kind of suspect that this specter of Egyptian decline was then later imposed upon the rest of history in the Middle East by various Middle Eastern historians using this framework of decline, of seeing decline in the history. And as for Western historians describing the history of the Middle East, decline did not become a great tool of analysis, at least not except to explain the later Ottoman Empire's decline and the view of the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe. But that is analyzed as a later development. And also you see a kind of tendency in a lot of European Western history to view history as being progressive, as things not declining, but rather progressing towards the better. And it was simply that the Western world was progressing faster and more strongly than the Islamicate world. And often this sort of progress was interpreted as being the result of various factors, often tinted by ideas about race and colonialism and ideas about European superiority, of being ascendant, of being in a state of progress above others. And though various racial theories have fallen out of favor, there is still a strong element of a progressive view in history in the Western world. Hence, it is a very different worldview, and thus this also affects history and the analysis of history, especially for history after the 13th century, where, for example, the Renaissance and Enlightenment ages are seen as ages of progress. I will just say that this is a very complex topic that I could go into a lot of other aspects too. I could also go into various theories that were developed about inevitable moral decline after the fall of the caliphate that was developed by Islamist historians as well, but I did not want to go there, and I wanted to keep this kind of brief. But roughly what happened was that what was developed in regards to historical studies about history after the 1300s was that it was a period of decline in the eyes of the historical studies made by Arab historians, and especially Egyptian Arab historians. In contrast to Western historians, who viewed this period and what came after rather as a time of progress and advancement of history, due to the very differences in colonial history. And I would also say that the pre-colonial Arab history and its various ways of looking at history became kind of disconnected also from later post-European colonization history. Not only due to Arab historians in Egypt taking influence from Western historical traditions and ways of analyzing history, but also due to the fact that they developed their history studies as a response to colonialism, and there was even before that kind of a disconnect to the earlier traditions of studying history too, due to the fact that there had been a long period of some centuries where history wasn't a very studied subject in comparison to other subjects among the cultural elites of society. And so they usually took these earlier historians' written history as sources, but they did not really develop their own theories from those historians, preferring to take historical theories and views on history from the Western world and modify it into a greater meta-theoretical framework of decline after the 13th century. That in turn had been heavily influenced by the specific features and factors of Egyptian history, in combination with the relative decline in comparison to the ascendant West later. That generated this sort of regressive history, or this sort of history of decline, which actually stands kind of in contrast to the more cyclical view of history that was common among many of the pre-colonial historians. And this has been kind of my rambling answer regarding the differences in history studies and views between the Western European historians and the Middle Eastern historians, and especially the historians coming from Egypt and Cairo, regarding history and developments after the 13th century. Now for the next question. It is from narrator of Tarikh 07. Who is better according to you? Al-Ghazali, Ibn Tufayl, Ibn al-Nafis, al-Bursawi, Ibn Kemal, or Ibn Rushd? Now, I will not say that one of these are better than the others, but I will say that I find some of them more important and more interesting than others on a personal level. And I would say Al-Ghazali is the top among these names, due to his importance as an Ash'ari theologian and due to the impact he had within the Ash'ari theological tradition. For my viewers that don't know, the Ash'ari school is one of the main schools of theological thought within Sunni Islam. And I consider Al-Ghazali to be second only to Ash'ari himself, the founder of the tradition, in that tradition. And though there is a lot of criticism raised against Ghazali and accusations about him being the reason as for why the golden age of Islam ended and why the Middle East and the rest of the Islamic world supposedly has receded back into backwardness due to the supposed anti-intellectualism that was promoted by Al-Ghazali. I totally reject this and these accusations. Al-Ghazali, even if I do not believe in Islam and believe in the theological assumptions he made, he is not responsible for these matters. And this theological thought actually has a lot of thought behind it, as does his attacks against certain philosophers as well. To be honest, Al-Ghazali is probably the second most, either the second most or third most misunderstood Islamic theologian, generally, by people that were not his followers. The only ones that probably surpass him in often being misunderstood are Ahmed ibn Hanbal and Ibn Taymiyyah. I plan to make some videos about all of these three theologians sometime in the future on this channel, as I consider all three to be some of the most important thinkers within Sunni Islam that really need to be considered and known about. In comparison, Ibn Rushd, who was a theologian and philosopher, though important for certain Western developments, as he became popular in the West, in Europe, under the name Averroes, for his various treatises in everything from philosophy to medicine and everything in between. I still consider him to be rather overrated and not that important in comparison to Al-Ghazali as an historically significant figure, due to the fact that Al-Ghazali's works to this very day are still important and taught, whereas most of the works of Ibn Rushd have been supplanted, and the theological tradition that Ibn Rushd represented has died out, more or less, though there are modernist revival attempts. Furthermore, what was taken from Ibn Rushd by the Western scholars and the like was often modified pretty quickly due to various reasons. And I do plan to make a video about Ibn Rushd and his legacy in the future too, so you can look forward to that too. As for Ibn Tufayl and Ibn al-Nafis, they were both famous physicians and men of medicine that became famous also in the West, and also theologians of lesser import. As I have a greater interest in Islamic theological traditions rather than in the history of medicine and the treatment of injuries and disease, that is to say medicinal history, I prefer Al-Ghazali simply due to that reason. Even if these two people are important in medicinal history, it is just not my field of interest. As for al-Bursawi, he is mostly famous for his criticism of Al-Ghazali, which I see as just a refinement of previous Maturidi being another school of Sunni theological thought, criticism aimed at general Ash'ari theological thought, just specified towards Al-Ghazali. Thus, al-Bursawi is not that important in the grand scheme of things, except as kind of like the main oppositional voice to Al-Ghazali. He's thus secondary to Al-Ghazali by being just the opposition to Al-Ghazali's treatise about the incoherence of the philosophers, Tahafut al-Falasifati, which he actually named the incoherence of the philosophers. Tahafuti al-Falasifati. And though it is a good rebuke, it doesn't really push him up like Al-Ghazali himself. As for Ibn Kemal, I will have to look into Ibn Kemal. I have planned to do it, but I have not gotten the chance to do so. And even with that considered, he's still not really on the level of Al-Ghazali when it comes to historical importance, I would argue. Even if he is an important poet and Sufi in the Maturidi Sunni theological tradition that developed within the Ottoman Empire. This is not insignificant, but Al-Ghazali is pretty much the Thomas of Aquinas of Islam. And I say this for those Christians and Westerners among my viewers that are not aware about Al-Ghazali and his importance within the Islamic traditions. I make this comparison between him and Thomas of Aquinas within the Christian tradition, just to highlight how important Al-Ghazali is, for those of you that might know about the importance of Thomas of Aquinas. And Ibn Kemal cannot really compare to that. So that is my answer, Al-Ghazali, due to the things that I mentioned here in my answer. Now lastly, I'm going to answer a lot of questions coming from one viewer with the name of Salman Naqtul or Sulman Qatala. Regardless of how the name is to be pronounced, this person has sent several questions, and I'm going to answer all of them, though it is going to take a bit of time. Yet I will try to be brief with them. But let's start with some of his questions. Between France and Germany, who has the best food? Here I will just answer France by far. There are good German foods, but France has just such a breadth of food. From the north to the Mediterranean Sea, there is a large diversity of different foods from the French cuisine. And I do generally prefer French food over German food. Next question is, which video was your favorite to make? I would say that I have 3 videos that I liked to make more than the others. Though not in any particular order, but I liked my video about Carthage, because with that video, it was one of my first videos, I learned a lot about how to edit videos. And I learned a lot about how to make a video. It was a big challenge for me and a great opportunity for me to learn about video editing. I also liked to do the video about Arwaz Suleihi due to the fact that I did a lot of very interesting research for that video. And I liked really the research part for that video, because it allowed me to look into a material that was close to what I normally study in real life, away from what I am doing usually with this channel and the videos here. But it was still new to me, and thus something that I found to be fascinating and something that I might actually work with outside of what I'm working on with this channel. So it had potential positive side benefits also for work outside of this channel for me. And that is why I remember making this video as one of those videos that I really liked making. Because it wasn't just about the video, it was about the process of doing research for the video that I liked very much regarding the making of this video. Though I also liked very much doing the video about Thanksgiving in America and its history, because it offered an opportunity to research something that I had never researched before in a field I was not familiar with, meaning it gave me a great opportunity to learn a lot of new stuff, and also it was a new learning experience for me. And I actually had to consult a friend about making this video, who is familiar with a lot of American history and knows a lot about where you can find interesting sources regarding American history and regarding the subject matter also, and how to search for sources regarding various subject matters that are connected to American history. So I learned a lot about how you research American history from making this video and from talking with him. Furthermore, I also gained some skills in deciphering handwritten English, Old English as well, which was a new experience, as I had only dealt previously with either old handwritten Swedish manuscripts or manuscripts containing Latin, but written in a very different way, with a very different handwriting style than what I encountered in the sources related to Thanksgiving and the earliest settlements in the Americas. And of course, manuscripts written in Arabic. which shares no similarity to the Latin script. And I can tell you it was surprisingly hard in the beginning to do this, as I am not a native English speaker and the English was rather archaic and written in a handwritten style that I was not familiar with, except that it was similar somewhat to how Swedish was written in that age as well. But I had not read a lot of manuscripts in that style in my native language of Swedish, so it was still very challenging to decipher first the script and then also the language used, or rather deciphering both at the same time when you were reading the sources. And despite being hard to do and hard to learn, it did give me a new set of skills and an opportunity to learn something new that I thought was actually pretty fun once I got the hang of it. So these three are my favorite videos that I have made. The video about Carthage and its empire, the video about Arwa Suleihi and her context and history, and the video about Thanksgiving and its history. And the next question is, what is your top 10 philosophers? I will give you my top 10 philosophers, but in no particular order, and I will just give a brief explanation why I think that they are in my top 10. Very briefly. First is Plato, as I see him as the father of the European tradition of philosophy. Then is Nietzsche, because I think that his philosophy is not only fascinating regarding his concepts about existentialism and creating meaning in a meaningless world, and his concept about trying to stand up for ideals in a world where there is no objective morality or objective ideals. I find him to be fascinating on a personal level. Third is Immanuel Kant. I could have included Hegel here too, but Kant could arguably be considered maybe the most influential German philosopher, though Hegel might be considered even more influential than Kant. And you could easily replace Immanuel Kant on this list with Hegel. Actually, I prefer Hegel as a philosopher over Kant, but I have Kant here due to his historical importance. But you could easily replace him here with Hegel too, depending upon my mood and historical interest in philosophy. Who you won't see among German philosophers on this list of philosophers I consider great is Martin Heidegger, despite him probably also being a contender for one of the most influential of German philosophers, because I absolutely despise his philosophy, which is a discussion I will maybe discuss some other time. I mentioned Hegel before, and the next philosopher that I'm going to mention on this list is one of the greatest of followers of Hegel. I'm of course talking about Karl Marx. Love or hate the politics that he proposed and inspired, there is no denying that Karl Marx had a great influence upon world history as a philosopher, in a way few other philosophers have had. Even if you disagree with his philosophy, it is still important if you want to consider yourself well read on history and on philosophical thought and on politics to have read Karl Marx at least once. And I do not mean only the Communist Manifesto, I mean Das Kapital, both the first and second band or parts, because his thought and the ideas that he inspired are some of the most important traditions of thought in modern history, regardless what you think about it, or think about the consequences that his thought had on the world. Now, going in the opposite direction of the political tradition of Karl Marx, I would say that another philosopher I think deserves to be on a top 10 list is Hobbes and his work The Leviathan, because it is a seminal work and one of the earliest works in the European political philosophical tradition, and continuing the trend of philosophers that I find interesting in a top 10 list that are also connected to political philosophy. The next philosopher is Giovanni Gentile, the so-called political philosopher of the fascists. Just like with the case of Marx, here we have a philosopher whose philosophy is more interesting due to the fact that it is connected to an historically important political movement. Giovanni Gentile being considered as the prime philosopher of fascism and a philosophical codifier of fascism. And here is a philosopher that I think is actually very unknown among many people, especially people that claim that fascism never had a philosophical structure to it. Because Giovanni Gentile very much was the philosopher of fascism. And just like I think it is important to read Karl Marx if you want to discuss politics, especially politics surrounding economical factors such as capitalism and issues with capitalism, or arguments for or against left-wing thought. You need to read Karl Marx. But for certain strains of thought that is connected to fascism, I think that Giovanni Gentile is also a must to read before engaging in argumentation about these political matters. And even when you do not like the ideology that he is connected with, he still presents a counter view that needs to be seriously considered. And you do not want to be the guy that claims that fascism has no philosophical structure to it and then get faced by someone that has read Giovanni Gentile and then begins to argue based upon him and his philosophy against you. And thus I include him here in the top 10 philosophers, not necessarily because I think he is the greatest of philosophers in philosophical thought, but due to the fact that I think he is a very important philosopher to have read. Similarly, but also very important to have read, I think that Carl Schmitt and his ideas about enemy-friend distinctions in politics is also a very important read. Carl Schmitt also has the advantage of the fact that you can apply Carl Schmitt to a lot of different politics. And his philosophy can be used to analyze a lot of things that happen in politics, both in modern politics and in historical politics. Carl Schmitt is an important political philosopher to know, and thus he is on this top 10 list. The next philosopher is also a rather obscure philosopher, and that is Georges Sorel, whose philosophy and the consequences of his philosophy can best be described as a strange mix of extreme left-wing thought and extreme right-wing thought, as he inspired both radical syndicalist leftists as well as the later fascists in Italy. And his ideas about how myths and how beliefs can shape thinking and action are quite fascinating to go into and to consider. Even if you, again, do not agree with his politics, which were pretty extreme. And I also have rather fond memories of using him and his philosophy to argue during my teenage edgelord phase. So there is that too. Less extreme in politics, but very interesting in the philosophical questions that arose from his philosophy is Jacques Derrida, one of the few postmodern philosophers that I actually admire and think highly of. Despite my butchering of his French name, I can't speak French, so you have to excuse me for that. I do consider him to be one of the 20th century's greatest philosophical thinkers, and one of the few postmodernists I actually think is worth considering. I certainly prefer him over Lyotard and Foucault, which are two other giants within the postmodern thought tradition, though calling it a thought tradition is kind of not really a suitable description, more like the thought tendency of postmodernism. Another philosopher that I think is very interesting to read, but now outside of the European philosophical tradition, and the only non-European among my top 10 philosophers, is the Chinese philosopher Zhang Yang, whose legalist philosophical tradition came to influence China a great deal, and whose philosophy I thought was pretty interesting to read about, and is an example of a very interesting philosophical tradition to study. And it is also a very important philosophical tradition. It and Confucianism being probably the two main philosophical traditions that have influenced Chinese history and thought. And these 10 were my top 10 philosophers. Now, despite these philosophers being in my top 10, this does not mean that I agree with all of these philosophers. I actually reject some of these outright, completely, and kind of consider them to be the opposite of myself in thinking. But I think that they are still interesting and important to read, or they are very special in their philosophy and stand out from other philosophers in such ways that you need to consider them. Or they simply have such an important historical role as philosophers that you need to know about them. And also, quite honestly, there are a lot of other philosophers I could have added to this list. Or many of these philosophers here that I could have removed and replaced with others. I just took the 10 first that came to my mind. The next question is, what is your top 10 generals? Again, I will not make a numbered list. I will just mention generally 10 generals that I think are important to know about or that I find interesting, though in no particular order here either. I will also interpret general here as being a conqueror or military commander generally as well, and not necessarily a general by title. So I will just mention generally 10 military commanders that I think are important or are in my top 10 of what I find to be interesting military commanders, or rather great military commanders. There are also a lot of military commanders that I would like to mention, but are not great enough to be on my top 10. Even if this top 10 list is just my personal choice, and this is entirely my own choice of what is contained on this list. But here you have commanders such as Khalid ibn al-Walid, who fought at first against the Muslims, but then later joined the Muslims and fought for them during both the time of Muhammad and during the Rashidun Caliphate later. And he's responsible for some of the greatest victories that the Rashidun Caliphate achieved. And is a truly underappreciated commander in Western history writing, because he is the equal of some of the greatest commanders of human history. Speaking about underappreciated, I also think that Garibaldi, the uniter of Italy, is actually one of the greatest of commanders in human history too. He is one of the main people involved in the process of the Il Risorgimento, the unification of Italy and the making of modern Italy in the 19th century. And it is quite impressive how he eventually managed to reunify Italy despite having many odds against him. And he's probably among the greatest guerrilla war commanders in history. And the only 19th century commander that comes even close to the next person that I think is one of the greatest generals of all time, of the 19th century. And that is Napoleon, which requires no further introduction, right? It is Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, which is in the triad of great Western military commanders, along with Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great, who are also on this list of great commanders, for obvious reasons. And those two can just be added to the list as well. But less known, but also a commander that I esteem highly, is Gustav Adolf II of Sweden, who is famous as the king that made Sweden into a great power and fought in the 30 Years' War. And yes, I know as a Swede I'm biased here, but you did ask about my top 10 generals, or rather commanders. And he is a king that I sometime in the future will make a video about. But he was a great military commander. Speaking about great military commanders, you also have Sun Tzu, the Chinese general who wrote The Art of War, a war manual that is still read to this day. So even if his physical conquests are not maybe considered that great, his legacy is still something that I consider makes him among the top 10 generals of all time. The legacy in the war manual that he wrote. Next is Genghis Khan, or Subutai as his general. And I do not really have to explain why these could be considered as some of the greatest commanders of all time, right? It's the Mongols. They created one of the largest empires in human history. And sure, they were hyper brutal in their conquests, but they still did it. And it is still very impressive militarily what they accomplished from a historical perspective. Likewise is the case with Tamerlane, who similarly to Genghis Khan and Subutai was extremely brutal, but also conquered a large empire. And to tie this together, Tamerlane also claimed common ancestry with Genghis Khan too. And speaking about Genghis Khan and Mongols, and what the Mongols conquered, I also want to mention a commander that stopped the Mongols, which is the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, who managed to defeat the Mongols of the Ilkhanate. And he also managed to finally completely eradicate the Crusader presence in the Middle East too. And to be quite honest, I consider Baybars to be a far greater commander than Salahuddin, who often gets the spotlight of high medieval military commanders in the Middle East. Seriously, Baybars was superior to Saladin in almost every way, not only as a commander but also as a ruler. And I plan to make videos both about Saladin and about Baybars, and to compare them, because I think that Baybars is truly underappreciated, at least in comparison to Saladin, who gets the spotlight, and to be quite honest, I don't think was either that great of a commander, nor an especially great ruler. So these were my top 10, though there are some honorable mentions that I think also could have made this list, and would have made it another day, or when I sometimes feel a little bit differently. And that is Charlemagne, as well as Friedrich the Great in Prussia, Selim I of the Ottoman Empire, and Charles XII of Sweden. And as for the next question, what types of topics do you want to do in the future? This is a very broad question, but generally I would say that I will continue with the sort of topics and areas of study that I have already done previously in my videos. History, various subject matters related to culture and religion. But I have considered some other stuff too. For example, videos about various types of fiction and discussing various tropes in fiction and fictional works from various perspectives, or analyzing some types of fiction. For example, discussing why certain medieval fantasy tropes do not make sense, or how people can incorporate an understanding of history into their works, for example, or an understanding of religion into their works. I have also considered about maybe getting into certain topics that are more contemporary and rather strongly connected to political matters of today. But I also do not want to turn my channel into a politics channel. I actually want to stay pretty politically neutral on this channel. I've also considered making videos about some of my experiences and of things that I've encountered through my studies in academia and through my over 10 years of being there. If I'm to do this though, I need to anonymize the people involved, as to not risk doxing myself and not to risk some sort of conflict with the people involved either, or institutions that are involved. And furthermore, I do not want to create inadvertently some sort of harassment campaign against the people that I discuss, or against the institutions that I refer to by other names in these videos either, or create some sort of drama that goes out of hand. Furthermore, it kind of also has the risk of devolving my channel into a gossip channel, which I want to avoid too. And I'm still rather on the fence if I should do anything connected to this, because I think that there is some value in it that others can learn from or that can be important to discuss. But on the other hand, I think that there is a lot of problems that could arise from doing this. So it is unlikely that I will do this, but it is a potential thing that I could discuss in the future. But generally, I will probably continue with the same topics that I've done before. That is to say, history, and in particular history about the Middle East, and videos about religion and culture, often focusing upon Islam and Arabic culture, but also doing videos about Swedish culture and Christianity too, in addition to other subjects too, as I like mixing it up and doing fun things on this channel, just because I like being broad and studying other things than what I do in real life, where I primarily study things connected to Arab history and Islam. And the next and final set of questions is, what is your top 10 anime and horror movies and TV shows? I will give my top 5 in each category instead here, because top 10 will be a lot for every category, and these will not be in any particular order, just generally which are my top favorites. As for anime and anime series, I would say that an anime that I liked a lot and still have fond memories of due to my childhood is the anime series for Yu-Gi-Oh! The original, before GX and 5D. This has a lot to do with nostalgia for me, and that the Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime kind of became the gateway for the card game for me. And then later I got into Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournaments, playing Yu-Gi-Oh! The card game, and got a lot of friends through that in my childhood. And it is this important connection with Yu-Gi-Oh! That makes me place it before other shows and animes that I watched in my childhood, like Sailor Moon and Dragon Ball and such. Another series of anime that I liked a lot and still like is Hajime no Ippo, though I prefer the manga. It is a manga or anime series about boxing. It's a sport anime slash manga series. And it is a series that I can recommend for anyone that is interested in boxing or wants to know more about boxing, since it incorporates a lot of the sport into the manga in a very natural way that also helps you as a reader to understand what is happening and why things are done in the manga as they are done with regards to the sport of boxing and all of the supporting events around that. I can highly recommend this series. Then there is Hellsing Ultimate. It's just a very good anime based upon a very good manga. It's an awesome spectacle to watch. Then there is the anime series of Slayers, which is a comedy, fantasy, satire anime series, which is hilarious to watch and also has moments of genuine adventure, fantasy and tension too. Seriously, if you love role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons or just have a general interest in fantasy, then you should watch this series because it is hilarious and it is also a very interesting fantasy series in itself. And lastly, among my favorites of anime series and anime franchises is Lupin the Third, which is a series about the gentleman criminal Lupin the Third and his various heists and adventures, together with his companions and friends. It is just awesome, watch it. As for horror movies, well, here I would say Event Horizon, which is an awesome movie if you like Warhammer 40k, because this movie could more or less work as a prequel to the Warhammer 40k franchise. And it is a legitimately creepy movie as well, where the main characters are not extremely stupid either, and are actually quite rational and try to get away from the danger once they realize just how bad it is, though to not very much avail. Then there is Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola. I just really like this movie, and it is, according to me, the best adaptation of Dracula in movie form. And speaking about Dracula and speaking about undead monsters, the next movie that I want to push forward as one of my favorite movies is Död Snö, Dead Snow, a Norwegian zombie movie that I like a lot. I also like A Nightmare on Elm Street, the first movie from 1984, a lot too, as it is my favorite slasher movie. And also A Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite slasher franchise as well. And it all began with this movie. And my two other favorite horror movies is Alien, the first one, from 1979, as it is one of the first horror movies I watched, and I watched it with a friend, despite probably not being allowed to do that by my parents. So it has a special place in my childhood memory, as a very nostalgic memory and movie. And then you have John Carpenter's The Thing, which is just also a very good movie, and more or less the archetype of body horror movies. There are some honorable mentions that I would like to mention here as well that didn't quite reach my 5 top favorites with regards to horror movies, and those are Vittra, a Swedish movie about a Vittra creature that causes a zombie scenario. If you want to know what a Vittra is, I have made a video about that creature, though I didn't mention it making zombies there because that is a pretty unique ability that apparently is taken from certain very specific myths about this creature from very specific regions of Sweden, and is not a common ability among Vitror generally, though the various myths and abilities ascribed to them are pretty vast, so it is within that common span of abilities. There is also The Blob, the 1988 remake, that I like as a movie that could have also been in the top 5. And there is also Salem's Lot, the 1979 movie, not the new remake. Ugh. I did seriously not like the remake. As for TV series that I find to be my favorites, I will also include a Western cartoon TV series here as well. Because due to nostalgic reasons, and this being a great part of my childhood memories, I actually still really much like Spider-Man, the animated series from the 90s. Yes, it is. I can agree that this isn't the best series of Spider-Man that has existed when it comes to stories, animation, and other such things. But I still very much appreciate this series as part of my childhood memories, as I loved watching this series when I was a little kid. Going away from cartoons but still being on the subject of superhero series, I actually loved Small Whale, which is a TV series about Superman that I liked to watch a lot in the past, and came at a time where there wasn't really much good Superman content around. But continuing on with live action series, but new superheroes. I loved the series of Primeval when it was running. A TV series about various prehistoric creatures coming back through time portals to Earth. And also some predators and creatures from the future also coming back in time through these time portals and causing chaos. And there are a lot of other plots also going in parallel with this happening too in the series. It is a series with a lot of good, campy, fun and action for a TV series that I very much appreciate. Another series that is still running and that I love a lot is the series of Midsummer Murders, a British detective or investigator TV series about murder mysteries. And lastly, and actually connected to my historical interests, even if you could do a lot of nitpicking and arguing that it isn't that historical, is The Magnificent Century, a Turkish TV series about Suleiman the Magnificent and his court and all the happenings around there. It is a very good series, even if you could criticize it for various reasons. I still like it a lot. And this was me answering all the questions. And it has taken nearly 2 hours to do so. And I tried to be brief with answering them. And I hope you enjoyed it, my viewers. Thumbs up for you, as you are the reason as to why I make videos. If there is anything more you wanted to ask, or if you want further clarifications about some of my answers to your questions here, then you can post it in the comment section and I will try to answer as quickly as possible. See you in the comment section of this video and in future videos. And the next time I have a big Q&A video.